Welcome to tutorial number 2 in the Fortress series. In this tutorial we're going to be discussing the truth of what the real problem is with most mental health issues. So in the last video I told you about a concept that was coined, the term was coined by Judith Herman, developed by people like Pete Walker. It's called CPTSD. Complicated sounding thing. I mean, CPTSD, it stands for complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I usually refer to it as CPTSR. But the way I want you to think about it is as multiple different levels of small traumas, let's call them microtraumas, lots of small traumas that have taken place over a period of time, multiple sections of time, and across multiple contexts. So across multiple periods of time, multiple contexts, where standard PTSD would be considered usually one time and one context. And so that particular time in PTSD would be singular. The day I was hit in the leg by a red car and it put me in hospital for 3 days. Every time, that's one time, one context. What's the trigger? Red car or crossing the road. What's the response? Whatever the predominant emotion was for that one context and that one time. Whereas CPTSR, I've added a further level of complexity here. So we have complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I don't like calling it a disorder in the same way I don't like saying that people who are have post-traumatic stress, it's not a disorder. That sounds like a personality disorder, which is permanent and pervasive and personal. It's a response. I prefer to say it's a response because if it was learned, that means it can be unlearned. It's not permanent, it's not pervasive, and it's not personal. So microtraumas take place over time across multiple contexts, and then we end up going through multiple trigger scenarios. So here we have a singular time and a singular context, and so we would have a singular trigger. What's a trigger? Well, when we pull the trigger on a gun or we yank the trigger on a grenade, there's one result. There's a specific result, a specific response. So I like this. Singular event, singular situation, singular trigger, singular response. Let's say the singular trigger for the silly example I gave is red car, and the singular response is fear. So every time I see a red car, oops, I've gone off there, or every time I'm crossing the road, I get that particular trigger response. Let me gently turn your head. There we go. Red car and fear. Singular. It's neat. There's never CPTSD without PTSD, and there's never PTSD without CPTSD. They're always together. The idea that they're discrete and separate is false. It's not true. So here's where it gets funky and it's tricky. So for us, over on this side, well, everybody has both. When I say us, I mean humans, all humanity. We've got multiple triggers. Every one of these events, repeated over and over again, creates multiple triggers. It could be public speaking. It could be being asked a question. It could be an exam. It could be when somebody in a position of authority speaks to you in a demeaning way. It could be something to do with sex, something to do with intimacy, something to do with food, you name it. It's all part of the human experience. So now we have multiple triggers with multiple responses. And what will those responses be? It's the full range of the varied palette of human emotion. From fear and all the subclusters of fear, which like anxiety, trepidation, anticipation, and then there could be You know, there are triggers for joy, there's triggers for happiness, and all the multiple nuanced little responses underneath happiness, cheerfulness, hopefulness, optimism, so on and so forth, right? So these are all of the different potential responses, but they're multiple. It's multiple. And they'll lean in a direction. So when somebody shows up and they go, I have depression, I respect the client. I mean, I've suffered with depression. It's a horrible thing, and I believe them. But there is a wry smile that occurs internally, because I always think, that's what you think. What you mean is, I've at least got depression, at the very least. But the depressive symptoms, the things that we're bundling up together, because we're civilized adults, and you don't want to come to me on your first session, say, for example, if I'm a psychotherapist or a counselor or a coach, and just give me the whole thing. So you politely bundle it up into one thing that's one word and go, it's depression. But we both know that that's a symbol, that's a placeholder for everything. Now, what's the everything? All of these different triggers and all of these different responses will go into a primary response. But that's what we're dealing with here, where it's CPTSR, PTSD, anxiety, depression, addiction, anger management, dissociation, all the different permutations of anxiety, like social anxiety or whatever it is. They're all going to band together into one of 4 primary responses, which we discussed in the first tutorial. So you will be taking all of these multiple context traumas, multiple context response, and they will all go primarily in one way. And it might be to fight, which would be to rage or to criticize and to attack, to flight, to fawn, to seek to negotiate, to negate your own needs, to placate a predatory enemy, to fight, to flight, which is to run away, metaphorically or even physically, to fawn or to freeze. These are all primary level responses to multiple traumas across time and space. Fight, flight, fawn, and freeze. Now I'm going to take a little hypothetical leap, and I'm going to say, if all of these things are here, where does this come into the major anger management, the major issues that people go to psychotherapists for? So possibly, don't take these too literally, because they're just words. So I'm going to start with depression. In my humble opinion, depression is at least 3 discrete different things that leads to the same set of symptoms. But we need to identify which of the 3 it is in order to treat it properly. So I'm offering you the broad version first, and then we'll dial it in the later videos. Let's say, for this video, depression is the freeze response. Because what is true depression? Some people who haven't suffered from depression say it's sadness. And it'll be like, sadness would be a flipping picnic compared to what depression is. Depression is a very physical experience. It's somatic. It's in the body. It's a kind of, it is an emotional shutting down, but it's also a physical shutting down. So that's where depression comes from. When you depress a button, you push it down. You suppress, you depress, you press the button. Depress is downward. So the whole system is down. So we could say that the freezing response, we could say, it's not the whole story, is depression. Flight, well, we could have a nice simple response there. That would be where our anxiety goes. I'm also for now going to put addiction in there, because we could say, though, addiction has a lot to do with fawning and freezing, but let's keep it simple for now. So the freezing, the system freezes. You're shocked, you're traumatized, and you just don't move. You can't move. For some of us, depression actually manifests as a feeling like we physically can't move. Some types of depression, the legs, the body, the chest, the arms get very heavy, and you will experience physical pain. You start to, from nowhere, from nothing. This is recognized now in mainstream medicine, that it's real. It's a real thing. It's not just patients malingering or trying to get sympathy from the doctors. It's recognized as a real problem, and it can be quite strong. The physical sensation can be quite strong. If you have, what do we say, anxiety, depression, addiction, anger management, well, that's an easy one, right? Anger management issues. If you're addicted to conflict, you have a lot of problems in your interpersonal relationships, you're just cranky, you're road raging, you swear too much, perhaps even some people watching this would have been in trouble with the law because you're physically acting out your rage because you don't know how to deal with all of this stored up trauma that's manifesting as like this bottled emotion, and so it pops out as rage. That would be the anger management issue. The fawn response, what did I say the major issues were? There was dissociation. So anxiety, addiction, and dissociation, I'm going to put all into dissociation, now sometimes called maladaptive daydreaming. Just, it's escape. Anxiety is, please run. Addiction and dissociation typically are part of the same drive to escape this reality, to be out of the body, because when you're in the body, you're in presence, you're in time, you're here and now. And you're like, oh, I don't want to be here now. Here and now sucks. This reality sucks. Let me escape. Okay, so gambling, video games, cocaine, alcohol, it changes your state and it takes you out of the body. They're all disassociative to the extent that that's what the intent of the user is. So they all come from a desire to run away from a reality that's unbearable. Where does the fawn response come into this? Well, the fawn response, this wouldn't be considered a mainstream, or it isn't considered a mainstream mental health issue yet, but it will be. This would be where we would put all the abusive relationships. So if you say, what are the main problems that people go to mental health practitioners for, it's usually given as anxiety and depression. But more and more now people are going to be going, and the results, this is how academia works and large institutions work, they're slow. So in 4 or 5 years' time, we'll see the research that indicates from 2012 until now, there's been this explosion in people turning up in therapy, in counselling, because they're in abusive relationships. Do you remember what the fawn response was primarily? That's when the animal is being predated upon and being attacked, and they try to offer something else. Don't eat me, eat this other animal. Don't eat me, eat my tail. You know, like lizards, you can grab them, the tail drops off, and then they grow a new one. Or there are other more disgusting things that animals do, to be like, eat that, just don't eat me. Which you'll be aware of if you've ever been suddenly frightened and you have a desire to go to the bathroom. That's what that is. That's part of a fawn response. People say, oh, it makes you lighter so you can run away faster. Maybe. I think it's to offer an alternative form of sustenance. So you have all of these primal responses, because these are not good responses. None of these is good. These are all maladaptive. They're all primal. So they're infantile, because when we as humans are infants, we're in an animalistic state. We're in a root biological state. So none of these is a good way to operate in the world as an adult. None of these is a recipe for success and happiness and fulfillment. If you fight, eventually you will go to jail. If you flight, eventually, along a long enough timeline of that happening, you'll end up with nothing. You will have nothing. People who are very strong flight responders don't have that much, because you can't if you're running all the time, because things and contracts and relationships will slow you down. If you fawn, you'll be there and you can have success and you can have things and you can have the external trappings of fulfillment, but you'll feel nothing, because you're never doing it for you. You're only ever doing it for the other. And so you're like the which Pirates of the Caribbean movie was it? The Curse of the Black Pearl, where the guys get cursed by the Black Pearl and they can drink whatever they want, they can eat whatever they want, but they experience no satiation from it. That's their curse. That's the curse of the Black Pearl. It's like a fawning response. You never experience it firsthand. It's always for the other. There's no fulfillment. Freezing is one of the most debilitating. These people won't end up along a long enough timeline homeless, but they might end up housebound. Their worlds become smaller and smaller. Similarly with anxiety, if you have a very high level of anxiety, a very pronounced flight response, this is where these two start to cross over. Because you can, in your drive, this strong drive for safety, seek to never leave the house. All of these are emotional flashbacks. So here in PTSD, where the time is singular, the context is singular, the trigger is singular, and the response is singular, we can remember what happened visually, auditorily. You can remember what you saw, you remember what you heard, and you remember what you felt. So you can have a flashback that is visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. Kinesthetic and auditory is a fancy way of saying in your body. So if I say to you, can you vividly remember what it's like to walk through your front door? Do you remember the sound your front door makes, the key in the door, the way it feels when you put your key in the door? Can you remember the colour of your front door? Do you remember the colour of the lock? What colour are your car keys? How does it feel when you have your car keys in your hand? You just went through a series of hallucinations or simulations, accessing memories around putting the door in the lock. So you can say, if you like, you just flashbacked to a time where you put the key in the lock. So when the problem comes and you experience the emotion, it's associated in your mind with a singular event in time. And you go, oh, whenever I see a red car or whenever I put the key in the lock, I feel this. Ah, okay. It's because it's about that. Over here, there is no visual auditory or very little visual auditory and kinesthetic remembering. So the remembering over here is purely emotional. That's why they're called emotional flashbacks, not visual flashbacks or auditory flashbacks or kinesthetic flashbacks. They're only emotional. So you see how this is so dangerous and so difficult to treat, because you had multiple traumas across multiple contexts, across multiple times. They gave you multiple responses, multiple emotional responses that bottled up, then needed to be expressed, and they were expressed in a primal way. They were a maladaptive, meaning bad. It's a bad way of, and I've had all of these. Everybody has all of these. Fight was a bad one for me. Fawn's a terrible one for me. And then in certain contexts where the depression comes up, it's a strong freeze response, and sometimes I will just flight, depending on the context, depending on the trigger. So I might be a different responder depending on the different triggers and where they came about, where the trauma came about in my life, and the different coping strategies that I developed over the years as well. So all of these would be considered maladaptive. They're not good for you. It's bad. These are all manifestations of emotional flashbacks. So if I've convinced you up until this point that, yeah, okay, I can see it, depression actually isn't, if you in your head are going, well, I never really felt like depression was the whole story, but it was the best wording for it that I could give, or I never felt like, I reduced all of my internal suffering and angst to anxiety, or you name it, but that was never the truth. It's because there's an awful lot going on there for everybody. Nobody has pure depression. All of these things are comorbid, but we have to try and reduce it to help people. If I've convinced you that this seems like a reasonable model for mental health issues, then this is the key that I've drawn here in this hard to read red pen. The key is the emotional flashbacks. Therefore, if the emotional flashbacks are reduced, you won't see depression showing up and abusive relations showing up and addiction showing up, because if we reduce the emotional flashbacks, and I have a method for you that I'll describe in the next tutorial, You will no longer be in fight mode. If you're not in fight mode, you won't have anger management issues. If we reduce the emotional flashbacks, you won't be in flight or fawn mode, so you won't get into abusive, or it's not that you get into abusive relationships, that's not the problem. The problem is people stay in them or go back to them. That's a problem. You want to talk about self-esteem issues, you try being in an abusive relationship, taking therapy for it for 6 months and then going back. It doesn't feel very good. There's a lot of guilt and shame that comes with that. Addiction, dissociation, all of that will dissipate if you're not flighting. Freeze, depression. You won't freeze if you're not going into an emotional flashback. So this is why this is key. You reduce, let me try and make this as visual as I can. So say I give you a method that doesn't eradicate your emotional flashbacks, but that reduces it. Say I give you a method and you try it for 2 weeks, and your emotional flashbacks, they just go down. They're just not as strong. The desire to fight is still there, but it's not as strong. The flight, there but not as strong. Fawn, not as strong. Freeze, not as strong. These things hold no sway over you. This, abusive relationships, when you're not flashbacking, you won't stay in abusive relationships. When you're not flashbacking, when you're not in an emotional flashback, you're not flashbacking, the addiction, the dissociation, all of that disappears. Because with this model that I've just shown you, what I'm saying, and this is what makes it a little tough to accept, and this is what makes it a controversial, it's not even a controversial diagnosis, it's a controversial model for the mental health people out there, or if you're interested in being a coach or a counsellor. The diagnosis of CPTSR is not controversial. The model is. Because this is pretty much everything. The only thing this doesn't account for is anything that is a result of trauma, biological trauma, or genetic issues, and psychotic delusional disorders. That's it. Everything else is covered by this. That's why it's problematic and controversial. If the emotional flashbacks are reduced, you're not trying to protect yourself in these ways that suck. These are now, they're still there, but they're reduced. If we eradicate the emotional flashbacks, guess what? We get rid of this. Get rid of these completely. All of these mental health issues around depression, anxiety, and everything else will dissipate. Why? Because they are actually maladaptive, protective responses. I know it sounds hard to believe, but depression, addiction, anxiety, all of it is actually just a bad and maladaptive attempt to protect you from this, from the effects of all the microtraumas. That's the end of tutorial 2. I hope that you found that useful. In tutorial 3, we're going to get into how to reduce the emotional flashbacks and all of the issues that go with them. As ever, thank you for your time and for your attention, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Cheers.